Hello friends, today we will discuss about disaster management, one of the important topics of mains examination. Repeatedly questions are asked from this topic. So we will discuss disaster management in parts. This is part 1 of the video. There will be 2-3 more parts of the same topic as this topic is diverse. There are lots of disasters. There are man-made, there are natural disasters, and there is SOP provided by the government. uh, National Disaster Management Authority provides a guideline for the same. There are causes, there are way forwards, there are the vulnerable areas of that particular disaster. So there are so many things. But first we will discuss the basics. And the basics will be also covered in the 2 videos. There are a lot of things which we need to understand, and UPSC asks many questions straight from the basic part of disaster management. So now begin our lecture. What is disaster? So there are 2 definitions. One definition has been given by UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's a very big kind of definition, and another one is the simple one which you can memorize and write in the examination. So the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction says disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following. What can happen through disaster? Human, material, economic, environmental, emotional losses and impacts. Losses can be of different dimensions. Alternate definition is a simpler one, that is, a disaster is defined as a disruption on a massive scale, either natural or man-made, occurring in short or long periods. It can happen for 2 minutes like earthquake, or it can happen for a prolonged time like forest fires. It goes and goes for several days, sometimes for even for months it can go. So the time period varies according to the disaster. India's climatic disaster risk map, if we see, so cyclone prone areas, this is the cyclone prone areas, mostly the coastal areas, and Bay of Bengal region is more prone to cyclones than Arabian Sea. But recently we have observed that this part of our coastline has also become vulnerable to cyclone. Why? Because of global warming. Then flood prone area, if you can see, then it is near here. You can see the parts of Uttar Pradesh, Tarai region of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, Odisha. The parts of Assam is also prone to that. Then you can see drought prone areas, this Marathwada region, etc. You can observe this. Hot deserts, this is the part of hot desert, and here there are different kinds of disaster than one has to face. Uh, and this is the fried desert, cold part of desert. In the Kashmir region, Tibet region, you can see Tibetan plateau, you can see Ladakh, Leh Ladakh, this is the region. You can see the fried desert, and there are lots of other kinds of disaster which are also man-made, which we will discuss in the later parts of lecture. So disasters, as I had earlier said, are divided majorly into 2 parts, natural and man-made. Now natural disasters are like cyclone, tsunami, heat wave, landslide, urban floods, earthquakes. So these are natural disasters. Man-made can be chemical, nuclear, or biological. So first, the difference between hazard and disaster. So hazard, let's understand first thing. Hazard is some kind of probability of happening a danger. So for example, a fire has been caught by a house, and there is no one living inside the house, then it is a hazard. If 5 to 6 person or 1 person is also living in the house and he was injured because of that fire, it becomes a disaster. So loss, when hazard meets the vulnerable groups, or vulnerable groups are exposed to it, when lives are exposed to it, then it becomes disaster. So the standard definition given by UN is that hazard is a dangerous phenomena, substance, human activity, or conditions that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage. Different kinds of losses can happen. So may cause, but it becomes disaster when it becomes certain. It becomes disaster. Hazards are such natural human caused events which can possibly become a disaster with negative consequences when people are exposed to it, as I had earlier said. Now, vulnerability. This was straight away asked by Union Public Service Commission in the examination, in the mains examination 2019. So, what is vulnerability? It implies the possibility of being harmed. In respect to disaster, it signifies the extent of exposure of the people to suffer damage due to hazard. If some flood is coming and the region is not well prepared, or it contains vulnerable groups like aged people, elderly people, so if they are exposed to disaster, loss of life can happen more. There can be more loss. So vulnerability enhances because of these factors. Then there is another set of definition, which is a standards UN definition. It says that a set of prevailing or consequential conditions arising from various physical, social, economic, and environmental factors which increases the susceptibility of a community to the impact of hazards. The causes of vulnerability, it can be varying. It can be due to economic condition, poverty, or it can be due to dense population. If in a city like Delhi, if earthquake comes, there can be massive loss because there is a dense population, and also rescue operations becomes a bit harder in such regions. Problems of economic opportunity, if there is lack of economic opportunity, the after effect can be disastrous. Unequal access to resources, if there is gendered stratification, if there are people of lower caste who are more vulnerable because of the lack of economic resources. So we have divided it in different factors like political factors. A policy making is one of the things which is part of the state's prerogative. If state has not made enough policy, if state has not prepared well enough in advance, then vulnerability can increase. If they are well prepared, vulnerability can decrease. Economic factor, if poverty is there, vulnerability will increase. If basic services are not provided, vulnerability will increase. So these kinds of factors do enhance vulnerability. Social factor, if there is high level of education, training, information availability. So there was a flood in Kerala, but it was managed very well. Why? Because there was more literacy rate, training was provided, NGOs became active. So socially they were empowered, and there was more cohesiveness because the caste factor is being diminished in the state of Kerala. So if it is absent, if there is flood in the northern part of Bihar where the literacy is low, so the impact becomes even higher. Even for the government to reduce the effect, it becomes quite difficult to do so. So the level of education, training, empowerment of people is very, very important. Then if there is huge population of women, orphans, old people, physically disabled, so if they are more, then vulnerability also enhances. Environmental factors, if there is environmental degradation continuously happening, it may result to a bigger disaster in the coming future. If in a particular area there is degradation of mangroves, so it can lead to more disastrous tsunami. Tsunami can come anytime. It's not in the hand of human beings. But the vulnerability, the exposure to it, the loss of life can be minimized if we safeguard our environment. And there is one example which I have quoted here as well. Infrastructural factors. If there is not suitable lands, lands equipped with the housing, agriculture, etc., then the vulnerability could enhance. If, say, for example, there has been a disaster in the tribal regions of Jharkhand and there is no road, So how it can be managed? It cannot be managed. Managing that particular disaster will become difficult, very very difficult. There is no proper land use planning. If you are making houses in the floodplain itself, so vulnerability will enhance. If house design is not uh, able to cope up the earthquake, if you are in the seismic zone 3 and the house design is not according to the earthquake structure, earthquake resistant structure, then vulnerability can enhance. Different types of vulnerability. This is one of the question which was asked by the Union Public Service Commission. So physical vulnerability could be there. It could be due to geographic proximity to the disaster. If you are living near the coastline of Odisha, there is high probability that cyclone will come. If you are living near the fault lines, there is more chance that earthquake can come. Social vulnerability, weak family structure, there is lack of decision making, there is lack of community organization, there is stratification in the society. It can lead to more losses, it can lead to more vulnerability. Social vulnerability is one of the aspect. Economic vulnerability, poverty is there, there is lack of resources, lack of enough produce, or the economic structure is not that strengthened. Attitudinal vulnerability, community which has negative attitudes towards change and lacks initiative in life, resultantly become more and more dependent on external support. You can see the example of countries which are becoming economically vulnerable. This is one of the main cause. So they cannot act independently. Thus, they become victims of conflicts, pessimism, and it reduces the capacity of coping with a disaster. The more happy or more prosperous a society will be, the more they will be able to cope up with a disaster. Take the example of Bhuj. Bhuj earthquake happened in Gujarat back in 2002, and in the record time, the whole Bhuj region was rehabilitated. So this was one of the factor. Attitude was more positive. Disaster risk assessment. So it's a method of qualitative or quantitative analysis of nature and extent of disaster risk by analyzing potential hazards and evaluating existing condition of exposure and vulnerability. So two factors are taken into consideration: exposure of people and vulnerability. So how much a disaster can cause destruction, people, property, services, etc. can be harmed at what scale. This is disaster risk assessment, and it includes several processes like identification of hazard, review of technical characteristic of hazard, and exposure of vulnerability based on the different parameters that we have given. These are a few factors which needs to be considered. Disaster management. So Disaster Management Act 2005 defines as an integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating and implementing measures which are necessary for prevention of threat of any disaster, it is reduction of risk of any disaster, readiness to deal with any disaster, promptness in dealing with a disaster, assessing the severity of the effects of any disaster, rescue and relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction. These we will read in greater details in the coming lecture. So two questions were asked straight away from the basic. One was vulnerability is an essential element for defining disaster impacts and its threat to people. So you have to put forth what is vulnerability and how it is deciding factor to assess the impacts of a particular disaster. How and in what ways can vulnerability to disaster be characterized? So we had given different parameters that you will write here, and different types of vulnerability with the reference to disaster. We have given the 4 types which you can write. So you can deal with this answer. How important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? Risk assessment we have dealt in the video lecture. Vulnerability also we have dealt in the video lecture. Write both and write how they are important. As an administrator, what are the key areas that you would focus in a disaster management? Write these points, 7 points. If you will write these 7 points, you will get very good marks. So this was the lecture. Thank you so much.